He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Climate change is coming. The catchment's already below sea level. So what does that mean for not only communities on the ground, but actually what does that mean for our ecosystem?
Kia ora, nau mai haramai ki te ao hurahanga. Hello and welcome to Our Changing World. Ko klekin kan tēnei.
Kia ora, my name is Tūmai. I belong to the Otago runaka, and I sit on the Te Noho Ako Tukiaewe Sinclair Wetlands Trust.
Tūmai Cassidy and I are standing in a part of the Waipauri-Waihola wetland complex. Harakeke, coprosma, carex sedges and grasses surrounding us, with a stream running nearby. It's an area that means a lot to mana whenua.
Great source of mahi kakai, our traditional foods. Incredibly important place spiritually, culturally, for our people of Otago. It's all connected with our history and our long association and occupation of the area.
As we chat, Dr. Chris Cavazos, a freshwater technical advisor at the Department of Conservation, heads out into the stream, getting his waders dirty.
So it's quite soft.
He's retrieving equipment that's been logging water levels and salinity for the last 4 months. And we'll get back to that. But first, a little bit of scene setting. These wetlands are about 20 minutes southwest of Ōtepoti Dunedin. So we're in the rohe of Ngaitahu, or Kaitahu. And the Te Reo Māori mita, or dialect of Ngaitahu, often replaces the NG with a K. So you'll hear, for example, mahika instead of mahingakai for food gathering place, inaka instead of inanga for the native fish, and runaka instead of runanga for a tribal council. The full Waipauri-Waihola wetland complex is a 2,500 hectare area that stretches from Lake Waipauri in the north to Lake Waihola in the south. The two lakes are connected by a system of lagoons, ponds, islands, channels and swampy areas. A wetland complex. Some of it public land, some private. But it used to be larger.
It's probably about a third of its original size, probably even less than that actually. So the lakes and the rivers are much larger, much deeper. They weren't full of sediments and mud in those times. Much clearer. You could see the bottom of the rivers, bottom of the creeks, all those things. And full of fish, full of native birds.
Yeah, I was about to ask in terms of mahika kai, what kind of things would have been gathered from these areas?
So our native fish, kokopu, we have the inaka, a whitebait species, tuna, longfin, shortfin eels, and kanakana, the native lamprey eel.
So today it's kind of less than a third of the size, and that was due to drainage of the land.
Yeah, so when the European settlers arrived in the 1850s, large tracts of the wetlands were drained and converted and still remain today as either farmland or animals, agriculture, even housing as well today. And so all of those things really contributed to, I guess, the decrease in size of the wetland, but the surrounding land use across the catchment has contributed to the decline of those native fish species, as well as the introduction of fish from Europe and North America and animals, mammalian predators and those things.
And part of this remaining wetland area is called Te Noho Aka o Tukiaewe and run by the trust that Tūmai is a member of.
Te Noho Aka o Tukiaewe is a settlement site, a village site, and a pa site, according to our traditions, that was settled by a man called, a chief called Tukiaewe, probably about 400 or 350 years ago. So incredibly important in terms of our history and our connection to the place. And so that property, 315 hectares, was returned to Kaitahu under our treaty settlement in compensation for the loss of our wetlands in the lower Tairi, but specifically the destruction of a lake known as Tatawai, and that lake was vested in our people as a native fishing reserve, and it still is classed today. The land parcel is still classed as a native fishing reserve. That was destroyed in order to create flood protection infrastructure, in order to protect the farmland and the housing that was built on the wider wetlands. And so our areas of food gathering were destroyed to protect food gathering areas of other people. And so Te Noho Ako Tukiaewo was returned to us so that it could be a place for our people to continue living off the land as we have for the last 50 generations.
And so that would have been 1998?
Yeah, 1998. We received that property was returned to us. However, the lake that was destroyed, Lake Tatawai, that was destroyed in the 1920s. So it's a long time in between those two dates.
The Trust's vision is to restore the habitat and reconnect people with the whenua through education and hands-on experience. Off a gravel road parallel to State Highway 1 is the small collection of buildings that forms the wetlands hub. A campsite, an office, meeting rooms, bunk beds, equipment sheds and a plant nursery. It's here that we start the day.
Everything you see here we've built in the last 2 years except for that building over there, which is the original Trust nursery.
Paul Pope is the project manager for a Jobs for Nature project called Te Nukuroa o Matamata.
Everything you see here has been built as part of the Jobs for Nature project. Tunnel house, potting shed.
Jobs for Nature was part of the COVID-19 recovery package implemented by the last government. It put funding aside for projects that would benefit the environment while also upskilling workers.
At the moment we sit at around sort of 23,000 plants in stock, and a lot of this material will go back into the wetlands. These are our kahikatea.
And kahikatea are the big pines that love waterlogged areas.
Yeah, so there's only, as far as I'm aware, there's only actually one kahikatea in this entire wetland complex, which actually Tumai Cassidy and I found last year, and it's a lone tree in a sea of, as I say, other plants. It's the only one round, so it's sort of sad. So it'd be nice to put, I think we've got about 2,000 kahikatea. It'd be nice to put 2,000 kahikatea back into the wetlands, and hopefully they will grow and flourish.
This project will wrap up in October, but for the last 3 years they've been working to restore habitat in the area. We hop in a ute to have a look at one of the weed projects the team has done. The wetland area near the hub has undergone some restoration, so it's looking pretty lush and full of native plants. But as we drive away, the scene starts to change, and there are lots more weeds. Along the gravel road, we pass by a planting team in high vis. We go over a stream that Paul says is key habitat for giant kokopu and climb up a little hill beside which is a small quarry. From here, we can look out over the stream, lined with willow, that now look a little off.
There we go. So this is a private block. It's owned by a contractor who has the quarry. He also owns another 70 hectares of wetland, which has quite an important creek, Te Waihine Middle, that runs through it. We approached him about fencing off the wetlands, allowing him to retain his grazing, and also about using a drone to actually kill the willow in the area. And he got quite excited about it. So what we've actually managed to do is actually do the drone work and get rid of the willow, fence it off, and now we've got about another 70 hectares of privately owned wetland to add to the wetland complex as a whole.
And in terms of the weed control, you used drones. Can you talk me through that?
Yeah, so there are some contractors floating around in the South Island who basically fly agricultural drones. The one that we use for this, I think it carries around 40 or 50 litres of herbicide at a time. And it's controlled much the same way as a helicopter would be in terms of CAA rules. But basically what it allows us to do is get into areas with the drone that we weren't previously able to. So where we are today, looking at the site today, it would have taken us months, if not years, to probably have dealt with the willow that's in this area by foot, whereas with the drone we're able to pinpoint and really clearly spray the areas that we need to spray. So the drone has been a fantastic tool, and we're actually asking him to come back later on in the next month or so. We're going to do some winter gorse spraying as well. But the technology of that, both the mapping, the control, and the areas that you can actually tackle with a drone are fantastic. I think we did total this year, I think about 210 hectares of willow control using the drone. The other issue, of course, is the cost. It's, I think, to do 210 hectares, I think it was about $48,000. So that's money well spent if you're looking at conserving the wetland from our point of view.
And what is the issue with the willows?
Willows basically do a number of things. First of all, they are voracious water feeders. They love to take up as much water as they can. They also tend to clog channels, so you get into mingling of roots of willows. Basically, sediment comes through, that builds up new pieces of land, and then they spreads it further. So effectively what they do is take over the wetlands by building up sort of silt islands and then suck the moisture out of it, because as I say, there's such voracious water feeders as well. So that's really the biggest problem with them. So yeah, we spend a lot of time removing them from wetlands like this.
And so you mentioned there gorse is probably next on the list. Are there other weeds in this area that you're going to try and tackle?
Oh, you name it, we've got it. It's look, we've got a whole range of things, but gorse tends to grow in dry areas, so especially around embankments, that sort of stuff. But it also, as I say, has the ability to spread out into the wetlands as well. The other big one here is Glyceria, which is the reed sweetgrass. It was actually brought here as cattle fodder in the late 19th century, and that is another one that really has become a problem for us here as well. And it's kind of one of those questions, it's just such a big plant to deal with, and that covers such large areas, as where do you start? So the main thing, first of all, we need to get the water flowing in the wetlands, so getting rid of the willow is a good start. And
as we look across here, we can see a lot of willow that looks dead, dying. It's kind of grey and orange. What happens next for that? Does that just sit there?
It just basically it desiccates, dries out, and then bit by bit it falls over and then rots into the ground. It takes a long time, it takes up to about 10 years, but we're lucky because it's not on a major water source in terms of we're not floating logs and other bits and pieces down into creeks, so it'll just fall into the wetland and rot away.
And in the distance, you can see a ute and 3 bright orange bodies. I believe they're part of your crew. What are they up to?
Well, I hope they're not bodies. I hope they're actually alive. But, they're actually, so part of this project that we've done with this landowner, we've got about a 1.2 hectare block there, which we're planting native plants into to add value to that part of the wetland and to restore it. We're also reintroducing kakatea back into this area as well.
And Te Nukuroa o Matamata, as you said, is a Jobs for Nature project. So how many people are working on the project? 22
at the moment. We started off probably with about 14. We end up with about 22. And then basically what those people are is young people that we put through their paces in terms of learning new skills. What we're trying to do is teach them to become environmental rangers so that they will take an interest in actually managing wetlands in the future.
I caught up again with Paul over the phone while putting this episode together, and he told me that a few staff have moved on since, including one to a ranger job. As well as the weed control, nursery and planting, the project's also been doing some species monitoring and animal pest control. This all gives the native plants and animals a fighting chance and improves the resilience of the area for what's to come in a changing climate. And that's where the data that Doc's Chris Cavazos is collecting becomes important.
So this is where our first one is located.
We're in an old boat shed at the edge of Lake Waihola. The little jetty off to the side of it provides a structure that Chris has attached one of the loggers to.
These logging devices, they log conductivity, which is a measure of salinity or the amount of seawater coming into the lake, and water height, so we can pick up that tidal fluctuation. They're taking measurements every 10 minutes, so they only have enough memory to really last for about 4 months. So every 4 months we've got to come, download the data and then put them back in the water.
And that's the task for today, and you've got 6 loggers?
Yeah, we've got 6 loggers out, so we take some measurements. So we want to do a spot measurement of water height and conductivity and temperature so that we can calibrate our loggers to that data, and then we'll redeploy them.
The 6 loggers are in different parts of the wetland. By detecting pressure changes, they determine water levels, which change with the tide, while the conductivity measurements gives an indication of how salty or brackish the water is. And why collect all this data?
Down here at these wetlands, you wouldn't really know it, but we're actually really close to sea level, probably centimetres above sea level. And even though we're quite far inland, about 10 kilometres or so. So with climate change, we know that the sea levels are going to rise, and by the end of this century, sea levels might be up to 80 centimetres higher than what they are now. So a small change in sea level rise is going to have a dramatic effect on these wetlands. So these wetlands, they're already experiencing some tidal input and salinity changes, and they're brackish already. But the question really is about what's going to happen under that scenario of 80 centimetres of sea level rise, or what are these wetlands going to look like in another 100 years?
A big question, and one that might have carbon emission implications.
Wetlands in general, they're really good at capturing carbon from the atmosphere and burying that carbon and locking it away. So, if the sea level rises here and the wetlands start to erode because we get these bigger tides, bigger storm events, all that carbon's going to be lost. And so that becomes an emission essentially. So that's another key concern we have.
Maybe it'll be fine. The wetland might grow at the same rate as the erosion and there'll be no net change. Chris is using other data about the bathymetry of the lake and changes in sedimentation to investigate this. Maybe it will flip to a salt marsh, which is also a good carbon burial system. But this would be good to know because the other impact is obviously that conditions will change for the local inhabitants.
This wetland in particular is a really important habitat for giant kakapo and inanga, and both of those species require that kind of tidal interface to complete their life cycle. So they're living up in the freshwater reaches of the catchment, but they migrate down to these areas here where you get the first kind of hint of the seawater coming in, and that's where they like to spawn. So when the sea level's rising here, that marine freshwater interface is going to move further upstream. So we want to be able to predict that and start doing restoration work further upstream so that those fisheries are supported and those native fish populations have somewhere to go to continue their life cycle.
As for this lakeside site, it's not really the healthiest looking. The water looks super murky. And you can probably hear the beeping in the background. Around Lake Waihola are some bare hills, others covered with pine, and a big site under development where a digger is hard at work.
We're seeing a lot of impacts from surrounding land use in this lake. It is slowly filling up with sediment. Probably once had a nice gravelly bottom and was quite a lot deeper than what we see today. So a lot of the vegetation clearing that occurred in the 1800s is probably still ongoing and introducing sediments into this lake. And then also there's some water quality issues to do with a lot of the urban development that's occurring around here and a lot of wastewater ending up in the lake. So a lot of residents will know that you don't go in the water very often in summer in particular. There's a lot of water quality issues.
Of course, this lake, this wetland complex, is all part of an even bigger picture. The whole massive area of the Taiari River catchment. And that's part of Chris's role, working on a doc program called Na'awa. It's a whole catchment approach to river restoration, a national program that's looking at 14 rivers across the Motu.
What we did when we started the Na'awa program here is we developed a partnership with the local Runaka, so Pukataraki and Otago, and also brought in the Otago Regional Council. And so we're all the 4 agencies here are co-leading this mahi. We started a group, we called it Te Mana o Taiari, and the vision of the project's to increase the mana of the river.
And in terms of the 3 years that you've been working on this, what kind of things have you been doing?
So there's been a lot of relationship building going on. We've been kind of leveraging a little bit off the 2 big Jobs for Nature projects here and helping where we can. We've done a lot of baseline biodiversity survey, so trying to understand what biodiversity values we have in this catchment. And they're pretty outstanding. If we're just looking at native fish, we're probably the most diverse catchment in the country for galaxids and maybe native fish in general. There's a lot of non-migratory galaxids that call this catchment home, and they're mostly only found in this one catchment, which is pretty unique. So we've done a lot of that baseline biodiversity stuff. Looking at Kanakana has been another focus, where they are, how many are left. So we've started that program. We've also done a lot of work to try and understand the impacts of climate change, and so that we can build a plan that makes the place more resilient to the effects of climate change. So by that I mean we want to try and influence people doing work here to do things that make them more resilient to what we predict the changing climate will look like. And we've also set up a monitoring program, so to try and pick up those effects from land use and climate change and try and understand the health of the awa.
And I mean, the catchment is a massive area. So biodiversity abundance and also some really unique ecosystems, right?
Yeah, so it's a 5,700 square kilometre catchment, about 300 kilometres of waterway, of river, just of the main stem, so that's New Zealand's fourth longest river, trivia fact. And the place is super unique, not only in terms of its biodiversity, but the ecosystems that we find here. So we've got, if we're just looking at wetlands by themselves, we've got these amazing alpine wetlands that are located on top of those flat rolling central Otago tussock-clad hills that we see. Those are super critical to absorbing water and getting water into those creeks during those really dry periods that we have down here. So they keep the tap on, so to speak. And then underneath those we have the scroll plain, which is New Zealand's only scroll plain. It's the largest kind of intact scroll plain system in the southern hemisphere.
And when you say scroll plain, can you just describe for me what that is?
I guess if anyone's ever flying into Invercargill, they should look out the window when they're flying over central Otago. You'll get this amazing view of the scroll plain. It's really hard to appreciate from ground level, but when you get up high, you'll see a river that's meandering through a pretty flat landscape. It creates a whole big mosaic of wetlands because as the river meanders and floods, it will create oxbows and the river course will change. So it's really just this really flat plain that's got this incredible meandering, winding river system through it. And it's quite large. It's about 40 kilometres long.
And I mean, we've been talking today about some of the challenges that are facing this area here near the mouth of the Taiari, like the wetland here. Can you talk to me a bit about the challenges maybe further up in the Taiari?
You know, if we're just thinking about impacts from climate change, it's a tale of two stories in this catchment. So the upper part of the river we suspect will get hotter and drier. We're going to see less snowfall, less frosts. You know, all of those things are going to influence the hydrology of the river up there. We might start to see those wetlands dry up. So there's an ongoing question in terms of how do we best manage this place. It's a pretty complex mosaic of wetlands that has been grazed now for a couple of hundred years. So we need to begin to understand how to manage that land.
The second Jobs for Nature project that Chris mentioned is Tiaki Maniototo. They've been working further up the catchment with landowners there, clearing weeds, planting natives, and fencing off stretches of the river. A comparison of current versus historical wetland extent shows that 71% of wetlands have been lost throughout the Taiari catchment. But just looking after what's remaining is a huge project across a very big area with many different landowners and stakeholders. Developing an overarching plan is next on the agenda for Chris. Importantly, through the surveys, they know that many key native plants and animals are still to be found throughout the catchment, albeit likely in much lower numbers than before. As well as the native fish species Tumai Cassidy mentioned at the start, Te Nohoaka o Tukiawa is home to an estimated 46 different species of birds, but importantly provides habitat for some threatened native species, such as the supercryptic, nationally critical matuku, or Australasian bittern.
We've done a bit of monitoring, working with Birds New Zealand, with the Department of Conservation, with Otago Regional Council, and over the last 2 years have put out sound recorders across the wetlands in some of those key feeding habitat areas where we think the matuku may be living. So far the only male booms that we picked up were on the Tino Hoako Tukiawa property, only from 2 sound recorders. But we know from some of our traditional knowledge that they were once really abundant in our catchment. They used to fly in flocks, large flocks, so large groups, not just individual lone birds as we sort of see them today, but there may be as few as 5 or 6 resident matuku living still across that 2,500 hectares. And this sort of comes from some of our whānau who've lived here all their lives for multiple generations, as well as duck shooters. We've sort of seen 1 or 2 matuku over the years, mostly in the same spots. So we either think that's either the same birds or it's just a really good feeding ground.
And one of these you caught recently on camera, right?
Yeah, so after 2 years of picking them up on the sound recorders, we finally got a visual. Yeah, so we put out some trail cameras just to monitor some of the areas and hopefully get a photo of one. And about 2 weeks after we installed cameras at Tino Hoako Tukiawa, we picked up got a shot of a matuku wading through the raupō.
Looking to the future, Tumai says they'll keep gathering data and using that information to help native plants and animals. And through that, people too.
When we don't have tuna, when we don't have kanakana, we lose words, we lose those traditions, we lose knowledge, and so we actually lose part of our own identity, and our identity decreases as we see our native species populations decrease as well. And so for us, it's not actually just about doing the work to restore the environment. We see it as by restoring the environment, we're actually restoring ourselves. We're restoring our identity, and we are restoring our well-being by restoring the well-being of the ecosystem. So our vision for the wetlands, not only part of it that we own, but the wider 2,500 hectares, is that they once again become thriving mahi kakai. And we're a long way from getting there, but we'll get there one day.
Thanks to Tumai Cassidy of Te Nohoaka o Tukiawa Trust, to Dr. Chris Cavazos, Freshwater Technical Advisor at the Department of Conservation, and Paul Pope, Project Manager of Te Nukuroa o Matamata Jobs for Nature Project. And a heads up from me that our monthly newsletter has just gone through a refresh. Visit rnz.co.nz/OCW and sign up to get analysis of what's going on in the New Zealand science sector, interesting little tidbits from Ellen and I, behind the scenes yarns for different episodes, and some podcast and reading recommendations. And if you ever want to chat directly to us, and we would really love it if you did, the best way is to email us at ourchangingworld@rnz.co.nz. Ko Claire Kinkananahau te kaiho tū o tēnei hōtaka I āwhina mai a Liz Garton rawa ko Ellen Rikers. I produced this episode with help from Liz and Ellen. Sound engineering was by William Saunders, and Liz Garton is executive producer of Our Changing World. Tēnā koe I whakarongo mai. Thanks so much for listening. Ko Claire Kinkananahau. Have a great week. Kia pai te wiki.